All right, so thank you all for joining me so we can review our last and final PowerPoint of the 8-week session. So we're almost there. So a lot of this will probably be repeat for you guys, especially if you joined me with a midterm. And so I think for all of the groups that I was able to connect with, I mentioned that a large portion from the midterm will appear on the final exam. So a good 15 to 20 questions will reappear. So I will go through some of this beginning section a little quick. So if you have questions on that, please refer to either the midterm or the midterm slides that will be posted or that have been posted to Blackboard. So the same for the final exam. I will make sure, or the final exam PowerPoint review will be posted in Blackboard. So again, touching on our very first article that we should have read in week 1 is this article by Jose Angel Gutierrez, The Chicano Movement, Dead or Alive. And this was really designed for you all to think about, what's going on in present times today as we're living in this moment. And a lot of times when we think about the term Chicano or the Chicano movement, we tend to think about the 70s or even the 60s when it began to manifest in that time period. So one of the things that this article talked about is this idea of this political context or this racial umbrella. We tend to want to clump every single race, not only the Latino, into one particular bucket. So for instance, Asians, they're all clumped into one area. And we all know that there's all of these different subgroups within that overarching umbrella. Same goes for the Latino, right? We have this overarching term. Now, when we think of the term Chicano, we tend to associate it with Mexican American. And I've noted in our midterm review that this term is an ideological term and it's not meant to denote race. It is a political identity. And so in essence, anyone can be Chicano. You can be black, brown, orange, purple, for all I care. If you embrace the political and social context that this term stands for, you can identify as Chicano. So again, where did the term Chicano come from? If you didn't see it last time, it stemmed from the term Mexica that was used to describe the Aztec civilization, right, or one of them. Mexica, as the Spaniards came, they employed the X to represent this sh sound, or the SH or ch sound. And so now you have Mexica, or in English you would say Mexica, right? And you start to see, as we begin to develop this word, how you can recognize the term going in from Mexica and turning into Mexican. So Mexica, Mexican. The next term, Mexicanos or Mexicanos, right? For short, Chicanos, or back in the 60s and 70s, that term began to become embraced as a word of empowerment. So Chicano became Chicano with a CH. And again, if you'd like to have more information regarding this term and the first documented use of the term by Jose Limon in 1911, feel free to check that out. So let's begin with Mexico. When we started this course, we spoke about the Aztecs, right? But also we touched upon some of the other pre-Columbian civilizations that had existed, and it was sprinkled throughout some of the content and curriculum that was presented here. And I apologize that everything went by so quickly because we simply only had 8 weeks. So I felt like there's only so much that we can do in terms of getting all of the information out there. And then, as fast as you can read all of these different, all of the different resources I was throwing at you. But we did talk extensively, about the Aztecs. We read the book Broken Spears, and then we touched upon other types of civilizations that were closely connected, namely the Olmecs, who were seen as the mother civilization in Mesoamerica or Middle America that gave way to all of the different other civilizations that would precede the Olmecs. And this has been apparent not only through artifacts and different things that were left behind, but also some of the deities that were shared through the civilizations. And so researchers now, the only ways that they can really make those connections is look at earlier or newer civilizations and kind of go back in time and try to draw those connections. And so, for instance, the deity regarding the feather serpent has been in existence since the Olmecs. And how do they know this? Because of artifacts that they found. And so that kind of was passed on from civilization to civilization. And then we touched a little bit on the Inca Empire. If you were able to look at one of the documentaries or videos put on by Professor Jared Diamond, there is this reenactment of the Inca Empire and the Spanish coming, which again was extremely similar to the story of the Aztec and a lot of the other stories regarding civilizations and natives that were in different areas. Were very similar and unfortunately were overtaken by other forces. So again, here we have outlined all of the different civilizations and a timeline to give you a sense for where everyone kind of manifested in this time period. So one of the main civilizations, again, are the Olmecs. And this is something that you would like to note because it will come up on the exam is how do you know really, the difference between the Olmecs and other civilizations, considering that a lot of their information was lost in terms of whether or not they had scriptures or anything of that sort, right? We don't really know much, unfortunately, because of the environment in where they lived, because of the marshy lands, because of the moisture. If there were any sorts of scriptures or anything of that sort that was extremely fragile, it would have been overtaken by the jungle or the moisture that was in the air or in that land. And so unfortunately, only the things that were left behind were stone carvings, maybe some wooden artifacts, but they are anything that is found in terms of stone carvings. You can know that it's coming from the Olmec civilization because of the big heads and the big stone carvings that were left behind. In terms of Aslan, we read a little bit through Mike Ornelas's book, and he touches a little bit about how this legend of seven different tribes manifested out through this cave in this region of Aslan. Now, Aslan, not only does it mean or reference this mythical land of the Aztec, but it's also associated with this term Azteca, and Azteca in the form of Nawa or Nahuatl in how their spelling was. So Azteca, we think of it being spelled Azteca. In Nahuatl, you would add an H, Azteca, which is the word for people from Aslan. And so there's this other legend that talks about this apparition appearing, and that apparition was this god Huitzilopochtli that basically told the tribe to migrate down south, right? And so this occurred in the 1300s. And so it continues that this god of war named Huitzilopochtli, the sun and human sacrifice, is said to have directed the Mexica to settle in this region of Mexico City, back then known as Tenochtitlan. They settled between 1325 to 1521. Obviously, 1521 is the fall of the Aztecs. And essentially, this god said, continue migrating until you see this iconic symbol. And that symbol is what is depicted on the Mexican flag, which is this eagle here perched on a cactus eating a serpent. And that would be the symbol in which would tell the tribe to stop and essentially build their civilization in that region, which became Tenochtitlan, which at that time was an island. Now in Mexico City, it's still on top of this island, and unfortunately, if you've been there, they said in several parts of that region is actually starting to sink, and so they're trying to come up with different ways to keep all of the land and all of the city afloat from sinking further down, because it's built on this island, so to speak. So as that is going on in the 1300s and the development there in Mexico, Mesoamerica, in that whole region, meanwhile in Europe, you have other things that are going on, right? So all the way back until from, as far back as the 700s, we have the Moors in Iberia. So the Moors were essentially also called the Berber, which were tied to origins in North Africa. So we have North African or African roots in this particular area of Iberia, or the Iberian Peninsula, which is referencing Spain. Often the Moors were referred to as Black Hebrew, and typically they were never recognized by the Jewish community, unfortunately, because of them being tied to African roots or being Black, right? Nonetheless, the Moors were extremely, extremely, extremely intelligent people and well-educated. It was said that they had many libraries and universities, and in fact, the Moors were more so literate and extremely intelligent, even more so than the Europeans, who were in power eventually later on, as we tell the story when we have in the 1400s and even in the 1300s, when we start to have the Spanish taking over this region and slowly but surely pushing out the Moors out of Spain, until we have our last Islamic state in Granada, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we switch slides. So, this whole time period is very interesting, again, considering the power dynamics, right? Interestingly, you have the Moors, who are extremely intelligent people, yet seen as subordinates to the Spanish, right? And the Spanish were in power, and you have the Spanish crown and different kingdoms, if you will, in different areas, right? Until powers unite with Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand. So this time period, which would have lasted at least 770 years, right, going on for a very, very long time. Obviously, the king and the queen weren't alive for that time period, but the whole idea of power and pushing out different types of people did manifest for a very long period, right, until we have the fall of the last Islamic state, as I mentioned, in 1492. So this would be referenced as the Reconquista, or the Reconquest, which was occurring prior to the discovery of the New World, and that would have lasted approximately 10 years. So here is, review from the 1400s. We talked about Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand and how they got together and finally wed in 1469. Queen Isabella was tied to Castile and that whole region. King Ferdinand was tied to Aragon and different parts of Sicily and different regions, until finally powers would unite. And again, King Ferdinand had a specific agenda, and that agenda was acquiring land as much as possible, right? That was kind of the the whole basis for him in through the age of discovery and expedition and exploration. Queen Isabella, on the other hand, she was motivated by religion and power, and so that is really interesting as it ends up being brought to Mesoamerica or the Middle America region, and we'll see that religion plays a significant part in the quest of conquest and expedition and conquering different people, aboriginals and natives, not only in Mexico but also in the East Coast, with the origin of the 13 original colonies in that region by New York, Connecticut, Virginia, all that whole region, and then going into what is now the U.S., right, in the Midwest, and then connecting with Mexico, and then fulfilling this dream of manifest destiny. Along the way, you had people being overthrown, right? Primarily, unfortunately, the indigenous population or the natives, and then also imposing religious beliefs. And so this was not different than anything else that was going on. But I just wanted to point that out, that as far back as the 1400s and even 700s, you had this going on, and in the 1500s in Mexico, and then the 1600s in the East Coast, and then later on going through the 1700s, 1800s, and then even the earlier part of the 1900s, and how some of these people were treated as a result for overtaking this land and this quest for manifest destiny. So again, Christopher Columbus, you heard the story before. He was in search of finding a quicker route and to the East Indies by going west, right? So that he had this idea that if he went west, he would land in East India much quicker, right, than going down and around Africa into that region. And so, as many people laughed at him, it was said that Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand also turned him down at one point. It was said that at one point it was Isabella, another point it was King Ferdinand. The stories go back and forth. Nonetheless, what we do know, at one point, Christopher Columbus was successful at convincing them to fund his voyage. And so, of course, they fund their voyage. They have the means to do so as a result of overthrowing the last Islamic state in 1492, which has a correlation with Christopher Columbus sailing the ocean blues, as that nursery rhyme goes. So, of course, there he goes, and where does he land? He lands in the Caribbean, and he, lo and behold, he finds natives there, which were the Taino, which is said that is tied to Puerto Rican or Puerto Rican roots there. And so, of course, what goes on? Exploitation, trying to get as much resources as he can. He promises all this gold and treasures to the king and the queen, and of course, he fails miserably. So this voyage, not only did he fail at it once, he failed at it 4 different times. And so he kept on going and sailing through his route to try to find this route, and he never did. He was never successful. At one point, he's arrested by King Ferdinand because he's thinking, okay, you're not finding anything and you're not very successful at it. But towards his dying days, Christopher Columbus was successful at yet again convincing King Ferdinand to release him and let him sail off one last time. And again, he was unsuccessful. So later on, finally, you have Diego Velázquez, who would be appointed as being governor of Cuba, along with Hernán Cortés, who would be with him. Hernán Cortés was not the governor, Diego Velázquez was, but they had plans to actually sail off into this new world and explore more beyond what was there in the Caribbean. And so they were supposed to land here in Veracruz. Of course, Diego Velázquez, for whatever reason, he pulls back and tells Hernán Cortés, well, if I'm not going, you're not going to go. And of course, Hernán Cortés says, well, I'm going to go with or without you. And he finds his own way to come up with money to have a crew and ships to sail off to this region, and so he does. Of course, he will be severely punished according to Diego Velázquez, and you kind of have a glimpse of that in the book, like 1 or 2 lines talking about Hernan Cortés having to ward off someone who was sent by the governor of Cuba, which was unfinished business dating back to this event that I'm referencing. So what ends up happening in 1519, he lands there. That's where we picked up the book, Broken Spears, and it talked about, people that, messengers that were in that region and seeing these ships, big, giant ships that were described as floating mountains on the sea, right? And describing their animals as huge deer. Right, and then the way they looked, which was extremely different than what they were used to, and unfortunately, they mistook Hernan Cortés as being the god coming back, Quetzalcoatl, back from where he said he was gonna return in another form, right? And so they treated him as such, and later on they would figure out that he wasn't the god that he said. And so I'll go through this area pretty quickly, given that we spent a lot of time last time in the midterm talking about his voyage. So of course he goes through here. He meets up with some allies, the Tlaxcaltecas, who were enemies of the Aztec, and found this as a great opportunity for them to ally with them and overtake the Aztecs. And along the way, they start to say, mean things about other allies of the Aztecs, for instance, the Cholula, and there's a huge massacre there. The messengers are going back and telling Moctezuma, who was the ruler, and he is fearful at one point, wanting to disappear and run away. But of course, because of these omens that they talked about for so many years prior to them landing in Veracruz, which is the Spanish, it was almost like he felt that it was his destiny to go through what was in store for him. So there's the book. We talked about these 8 omens that appeared, right? Of course, the arrival of the Spaniards coming. You see the route that was taken all the way to Tenochtitlan. You have finally, after all of, I'm missing a lot of different pieces, but not to worry, they won't be on the test, but just to touch on it, you have these messengers going back and forth, and they're trying to ward them off by giving gold and different treasures. But of course, this only entices the people to want to come to this main city of Tenochtitlan and meet Moctezuma. Well, finally, as the Spaniards arrive in Tenochtitlan, you have Moctezuma and his nephew and Cuitlahuac, that they have this little powwow, right? They're talking about whether or not they should let the foreigners or the intruders come into this land. Of course, Cuitlahuac warns against allowing the Spaniards into Tenochtitlan, but the powers that be, which are Moctezuma and his nephew, decide, no, we're going to let them in as our friends and welcome them and greet them with open arms. And so Cuitlahuac was kind of like, well, don't say I didn't tell you so. And so it is that they would come and finally meet Moctezuma. So they go out to meet Hernan Cortés. This is where you have La Malinche or Malintzin or Malenali, whichever name you want to reference. La Malinche is there serving as translator because she's able to translate between Spanish and Nahuatl. And so they're there negotiating. Of course, they greet him again with gifts. Cortés is there, very smart in a way, not really calling commands until he's really sure that he got everything that he can, and this is referencing to the gifts and flowers and gold that was sent there by Moctezuma. So of course, as he hears, gets everything that he can, he sends out his commands, and they take possession of the city. Of course, Motecuzoma is shackled and sent up to this to the main temple, or the pyramid. The Spanish obviously reveal their greed, asking about different treasures, asking for the treasures in that land, and then eventually asking for the personal treasure of Motecuzoma, right? And so, of course, throughout this time, it's very interesting in how Motecuzoma is leading, and his leadership is very, passive. And so, whatever Cortés wants, he gives, right down to the part where they're tired and they want food and drink, and they say, okay, yeah, don't worry about it, we'll get you that, and tomorrow you'll have enough energy and come back and ravage the city some more. And so that's kind of a slap in the face that many times people are surprised by the details of the book, and really questioning, why isn't he protecting his land and is so compliant to what the demands are from Cortés. So, of course, as I mentioned, Motecuzoma is handcuffed, shackled, and put in this pyramid. Around the time is the time to prepare for the fiesta in honor of Huitzilopochtli, who is again the god of war. The people of the land, they approach Motecuzoma and ask whether or not they can prepare for the fiesta and actually celebrate, right? And they're all excited because they want to show the new people, who are the Spanish, how they celebrate. And of course, the Spanish, they have a hidden agenda, and they're saying, yes, this is the perfect opportunity, because they're going to be kept off guard, right? And so, yes, of course, show us how you celebrate. And what? You're going to have all of your finest warriors and princes and chiefs come up and celebrate for this fiesta in one place, which is this patio designated within this temple. Of course, let them in. And what ends up happening, there is a huge massacre there that takes place. Of course, Cuitlahuac is almost like shaking his head, like, I knew this was going to happen. He's the person who actually is responsible for, or said to be responsible for, rallying up the people and having them really revolt against the king Motecuzoma, and saying different things like, you're no longer our king, we're not going to listen to you, to the point where they're throwing different types of stones to that area. And it said that one of them even hit Motecuzoma, the king, until, to the point of his death. So there's two stories there. There's one that he is killed by his very own people. There's another that, as the Spanish were attacking the celebrants in that patio of the pyramid, of the temple, that one of them actually killed him. We don't know, but for sure we know that Motecuzoma dies, right? And so as a result, Cuitlahuac would be the next person following the king to be the next one in leadership positions. So by this time, the people are so upset that they actually end up holding captive the Spanish, or are successful in chasing them off. And so, of course, the people are left with so much to clean up after the departure of the Spanish and Cortés and his men. And so they're thinking, okay, they're not going to come back. Let's clean up this mess. Let's identify the bodies. Let's mourn for the dead. Let's let the people know. And so that's what they did. Unfortunately, they didn't know that what would be left behind would be the plague of smallpox. And so, unfortunately, many died as a result of this plague. And in fact, Cuitlahuac, who was the next, one in line, or the newly appointed king, would have died of the plague as well. And so now, at this time, Cuauhtemoc would become king. And so many battles would have occurred here in different areas, right, until the final surrender of Tenochtitlan. And so they put up a great fight. They went back and forth until finally Cuauhtemoc said, okay, my people had enough. At one point, he tries to even escape, even though he was in this war canoe. And of course, the Spaniards saw him trying to escape. And so then Cuauhtemoc like, okay, fine, yes, this time it's for real. I will surrender. And so he surrenders, and that is the end of this story. And so that would have occurred in 1521. So again, in 1519 is the arrival of Hernan Cortés and his men coming to Veracruz until 1521, which would mark the end of the Aztec Empire. Now, what happens here? Well, as a result of this fall of the decline, of course, you have many men coming into this region. So not only do you have Spanish men, but you also have African men coming in here and African women. You have people mixing with different people, right? You have mestizos mixing with mestizos. What ends up happening is now there's so many different types of mixtures that now there's this need to notate what type of people there is, right? For a lack of a better word. So now we have the introduction or the birth of this casta system. And so here are some examples of what I mean. So for instance, they literally wrote down in their books and drew a picture of what an Español with an India would equate to. And in this case, you see on the left-hand picture here, mestizo, or mestizo con españolo is a castizo, or castizo con española is español, right? And so, and the list goes on and on and on. And if you recall one of the videos, the Black Grandma in the Closet, there is a reference to this casta system in there as well. So what are the consequences? Really, the point of this is to really categorize this system, right? We're able to now show who's at the top of this hierarchy, who is at the bottom. Unfortunately, we have negros and indios, so the blacks and the indigenous at the very bottom, with Spanish blood or Spanish descendants at the top, which would mean the Españolos and the criollos. So the criollos and Españoles, Españoles would also be referred to as the peninsulares or gachupines, right? But more commonly peninsulares, meaning that they were descendants of the Iberian Peninsula, right? Meaning Spain. They were born in Spain, and the criollos were essentially descendants of the peninsulares, but were born in the New World or New Spain, if you will, which is present-day Mexico or Mexico, right? They were at each other's throat, unfortunately, back and forth, because they were trying to fight for power. And later on, when we talk about the plan of the three guarantees, that is when this sort of fight gets put to rest, where they finally make this policy, which is interesting, about people being seen as equals. And it's so interesting how the peninsulas and criollos were written into policy, but not the people of color or those who were extremely marginalized during this time period. So again, you have this video, Black Grandma in the Closet, that talks about this mixture and really this forgotten identity, the Black identity that exists, especially in the Veracruz region. He makes reference to that port that would be similar to what we see or we talk about in American history as Ellis Island, the port of immigration where immigrants would come through. That is the equivalent in Veracruz, and there's this port there that's made of stone, and he even says, like, this is like the mark of Black history in that area. So I would highly recommend seeing this video, at least 20-30 minutes into it, where he talks about that. And even you have a historian there that talks about how having a slave, a Black slave, was seen as a commodity. And I think I want to say the reference was to like 400 pesos. Don't quote me on that, but it was some sort of number that was the same as what it costed to purchase a home, right? So you really had to be well off to be able to afford this commodity. Again, Professor Jared Diamond, he has his video, and he talks about this idea of the haves and have-nots. The part one focused on this idea of environment and geography. And then the part two really touched on the indigenous or the Inca in South America. And again, very similar story to what we read with the Aztecs and the Spanish coming in and really chasing after the king. And so you had a similar story there in South America. However, the main difference was that the king of the Inca wasn't as passive as Moctezuma, who was associated with the Aztecs. So now moving forward, so again, remember 1521 was the fall of the Aztec. We had racial mixing. So there was this need to really create this casta system or this racial hierarchy that existed during that time. But then also there is this need for bringing in religion, right? There is this idea that, oh, these quote unquote savages are uncivilized and we need to civilize them. They came and they were naked and didn't have clothing, and we need to save them by imposing these religious beliefs, right? And so this is where you have the early introduction of the Virgen de Guadalupe or the Virgin Mary in 1531, and it's connected to Juan Diego, who apparently was walking through this region and in Mexico, and was passing through this hill in Tepeyac, and on his way to church. And so all of a sudden you have someone appear before him, and this is, the Holy Virgin Mary or the Virgen Maria comes and talks to him, right? And she was described as having features that were very indigenous, and she was a brown or tan, La Virgen Morena, as they say, the tan Virgin Mary appeared and addressed Juan Diego in Nahuatl. It was said in his language, right? And so remember, at that time, you had really limited choices in terms of retaining your own religious beliefs, if you will, or having to convert into Christianity. And oftentimes, more than not, you were forced into Christianity. And so you either assimilated and acculturated into the dominant society that was being imposed upon the groups there, right? Or you had to get up and leave or be executed for not following this idea of Christianity. So it said that Juan Diego, he passes this hill, and out comes this Virgen. And the Virgen says, well, I want you to send a note to the bishop, and I want him to know that I want a church to be built on the hill. And so Juan is instructed to go off and address the bishop, and he does. And he tells the bishop, hey, I saw this image of the Virgin Mary, and she wanted me to send you a message to build this church. And so the bishop didn't really believe him. And so he wanted to, get some sort of sign, right? And so he sends him back, and Juan Diego goes and he approaches the Virgen, and the Virgen says, okay, you want a sign? Well, I want you to go to this particular area, and during this time, it's the middle of winter, and she says, I want you to go there, and you're going to see these beautiful roses that you've ever seen, and I want you to pick them up and bring them to me. And so, mind you, it's middle of winter, and typically you wouldn't see roses growing in the snow or around snow or in cold climate. So he goes, and of course he finds these flowers, and so he picks them up, and he has a shawl with him, and he puts them in the shawl, and he bundles them up and takes them to the Virgen. And so he says, okay, I have this. And she goes, okay, well, I want you to take this bundle and send it to the bishop, and this is the sign. And so he's scratching his head, and he says, okay, I'm going to do that. And so he goes up to the bishop, and he gives them the bundle, and he says, here's the bundle of roses that is sent to you as a sign from the Virgen. And so he unravels the shawl in which the roses were, and out appears this beautiful image of the Virgen. And so now this story goes across, all of the land, and everyone's very, at all like, oh my gosh, did you hear what happened to Juan Diego? And all these rumors start spreading, right? And so, of course, they start to build this basilica, or this church for the Virgen, right? And so, that is kind of the story that is told during that time frame. Now, what is interesting about this particular story is that some people, such as Mirande, who is a prominent scholar in Chicano and Chicana studies, and he talks about the coincidental significant connection and awful resemblance to Aztec culture or Mexica culture in terms of this particular figure. Now, this Virgen, she's depicted as this Virgin Mary, Catholic saint who addresses this man in his language, right? And so Miranda says, well, it's interesting how she resembles this Indian precursor named Tonantzin, who was said to be the goddess of Mother Earth, or the protectress of the Aztec, so the protecting mother, if you will. And so some historians think that the awful connection to that was used as some sort of propaganda in order to get more people to want to convert to Catholicism. So they used this story, whether or not it was true or not, I'm not sure. I wasn't there during that time period. But one story is that maybe it didn't happen, and the powers that be, who were in charge of the church, wanted some sort of hope, or came up with they devised a story, and knowing that people would catch word and then want to convert on the basis of what happened to Juan Diego, who was Aztec, convert to Catholicism. So interesting as how this ends up being, the way the story is spun, and how the Virgen ends up becoming this national patriotic symbol of the Mexicano. Sometimes you see her as being depicted as this woman who protects the Mexican people. Sometimes you see her reprinted on the Mexican flag. Sometimes as being this person that will protect the people, and the list goes on. And so it's kind of interesting to see that sort of correlation. So that's going on. Whether or not it's true, whether it happened, it was used as a way to have many more people, many more indigenous people convert into Catholicism. And that's what ended up happening, because the idea was, well, if this happened to Juan Diego, then maybe there's a reason why she appeared, and she appeared on before him, speaking in his language, and so forth. So as this is going on in Mexico, back in Europe, you have different things going on. So now we're moving forward to 1588, the defeat of the Spanish Armada. Of course, you have Queen Elizabeth there, who was, very powerful. Of course, she had some ideas in regard to her Christian faith, and she felt that there's many errors in the Roman Catholic Church. And so as a result of that, she felt that there needed to be a new establishment of this so-called Christian faith. And so now you're starting to see this Protestant faith begin to emerge. So this is kind of like the early beginnings of really breaking away from Roman Catholicism. And so at this time, King Philip, even it was said that it was rumored that he even tried to ask for her hand in marriage. Of course, she declined. And, the basis of their argument was essentially war over religion, right? Of course, we talked about the Spanish Armada for years and years and years. It was said that he was going to have this fleet of ships come into the canal and overtake this kingdom of Queen Elizabeth in order to reclaim that land, to become Roman Catholic once again. So what ends up happening, of course, the forces of nature worked against the Spanish and in favor of the English. And Queen Elizabeth believes, oh, it was God. God protected me, and my faith is so powerful that that's what allowed us to win, right? And so that's interesting how the ways people really viewed themselves in terms of this. They believed something so much that it was almost like now looking back, you're like, okay, well, that was just simply the act of nature, but for her it was the act of God or some miracle that helped her defeat this other individual, right? So all of that is going on, and of course later on we'll talk about how people were still feeling like very fearful of people really becoming persecuted over their religious beliefs. And so later on, closer to the 1600s, now you have the English going fleeing that area and wanting to settle in the East Coast. But first, back in Mexico, what is going on, you have the Spanish crown there, and they're really starting to name particular people, Juan de Oñate being one, as governors of different regions of the land in Mexico, because they wanted to populate Mexico, right? And really have a strong extension of New Spain or Mexico, which we know it as um, as we know it today, right? Juan de Oñate, I'm not going to go too much into detail, but of course, it was said because of the policies, if you were a mestizo or not connected to, those that were seen at the tip tops of the hierarchy, that you weren't allowed to rule different areas. And of course he was no exception in terms of how it was suspicious of whether or not he was even qualified to be in the role that he served. Of course, it was said that he was wealthy, and so nonetheless he would be chosen to colonize New Mexico. And so, of course, he colonizes this area. The Acoma are there. Things happen, and what ends up happening is you have some of Oñate's men were ambushed and killed by the Acoma. Not all of them, of course, but Oñate takes it upon himself to declare war over all of the Acoma in order to show force and really make an example out of this particular tribe. Of course, this leads to this massacre of 1599, right? There's this 3-day battle. He kills so many different natives, the Acoma there. Those that are survived are held hostage, and he thinks about how he's going to charge some of the people that remain from the Acoma. Of course, he pronounces these different sentences, namely saying that, 1 foot would be cut off, especially if you were a man over the age of 25. Everyone else, for the most part, would be placed into servitude, and especially those that were under 12 years old would be under the supervision of the colonists. So long story short here, what was interesting about this particular man and the crimes that he committed, unfortunately, in Texas, you had, the powers that be, the council members, if you recall the video there that was shared, where they decided to pay a sculptor by the name of Hauser, I believe is his last name, a world-renowned sculptor, to sculpt this huge statue in name of Juan de Oñate. And so many people were in favor of it. However, many were also against this. Unfortunately, it stayed there, but that was a huge slap in the face, and that makes you think about how sometimes when you are in leadership roles, it's really your responsibility to make sure that you're really researching some of the things that are being thrown at you in order to represent the people who are there. And so unfortunately, the descendants of the Acoma who were living in Texas had to deal with this huge statue to be placed smack in the middle of that town. So as that's going on in Mexico, you also have other people that are being commissioned to govern different parts of Mexico or New Spain. Meanwhile, in the U.S. or pre-U.S., you have people that are escaping the European colonies there, or the European areas, the United Kingdom specifically. So you have the English coming over in 1607, setting up shop in Jamestown, Virginia. Many people, settled again to escape religious persecution. This is not to confuse with the Pilgrims who founded Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1620. You had, the English settling there. And then, of course, you had natives who kindly greeted them, right, with food and shelter, so that way they can survive. Those people were connected to the Powhatan Confederacy, who has connections to Pocahontas. Yes, Pocahontas was a true story, however, not the way Disney depicts it. Pocahontas did not marry John Smith. Of course, Captain John Smith was one of the people who arrived in Jamestown, Virginia in 1607, and that would mark the official early settlement of the English settling, or the first colony settling in the East Coast. So in this time frame around June, Powhatan sent some sort of ambassador to seek peace. He gave them food, just really extended their help wherever they could. Now, at one point, there is a story where John Smith came, and there was almost like this setup or reenactment that was going on to show force to Smith and his people. It was said that they didn't intend to kill him at all. Everything was just kind of like a setup, but really they wanted to bestow fear upon him. And so it was said that Pocahontas came, and she kind of, threw herself at the mercy of this person, and really tried to protect him. And so it was said that John Smith wrote about some of the encounters that happened, and he really exaggerated some of the things that went on. But nonetheless, she was there. She didn't marry John Smith, as I mentioned, but she did marry a John Rolfe. So quickly, Pocahontas, because of things going back and forth between the natives and the earlier colonists there, eventually Pocahontas would have been held in captivity or hostage as a result of some of the things that were going on, and some of the promises that weren't made by Chief Powhatan. Now, eventually, Pocahontas would have married John Rolfe. She would have converted into Christianity. Unfortunately, on her voyages back to Europe, it was said that she caught disease, and she would have died at a very young age. Shortly after her death, Chief Powhatan would have died as well. Then it was said his brother would have taken over between the years of 1622 and 1644 at his very old age. He was strongly opposed of the English settlers, and it was almost his mission to make sure that he would drive all of them away, and he did not trust them whatsoever because of all of the chaos that had gone on in such a short time period. So this takes us later on to the 1700s. So as we're beginning to develop this particular region, as you see here in the map, in the East Coast, you have Great Britain having control of this area. So despite the fact that you have English settlers trying to escape England, right, they're settling there, and it's almost like the Mexicans in New Spain, right? They're trying to release control of Spain. Of course, that's an extension. Mexico at one point was an extension of Spain, so hence the name New Spain. You also had Great Britain here, or the extension of New England in this region. You end up having these different little disputes against the Indians, but then also this in particularly, the French and Indian War, sometimes this name is misleading. People think it's an actual war between the French and the Indian, although some of that did kind of manifest. In this case, you had the French and the Indian, or Indian allies of the French, and also Indian allies of the English, um, were going on and off in terms of war and battle. In this case, when we're talking about the French and Indian War, you had the English actually fighting the French and the Indians. So it's kind of confusing. I know you read the term French and Indian War, so you think, oh, okay, it's a battle between the French and the Indian, but really it's a battle between Great Britain and the French, who have Indian allies. Now, interestingly, the British also had Indian allies as well. So that's interesting, which is an interesting fact, where Indians also fought with the British. At any rate, we had all of these different little wars and proclamations that went on, and you'll see here how it's kind of noted in some of these bullet points, all the way down to the American Revolutionary War from 1775 to 1783, and then ending with the Treaty of Paris in 1783. So something there that I didn't note is, when we talk about American independence. American independence happened during the time of American Revolution. So American independence was declared and signed on July 4th, 1776. So it was 1 year after the American Revolutionary War. But it wouldn't be until 1783 when Great Britain would have finally acknowledged the U.S. to be independent, which later on you would have this treaty, or this contract, right, of Treaty of Paris of 1783. So hopefully that makes sense. So the American Revolution was going on for some odd years, from 1775 to 1783. But 1 year into the American Revolutionary War, you would have had American independence declared, but the Brits would not have fully acknowledged their independence and being sovereign from any type of rule until 1783. And then that's where the contract of Treaty of Paris would come into play in 1783. So hopefully that makes sense. And so here is kind of a little snippet, if you saw the map change, where how Great Britain is expanding its territorial rule and where Spain lies. So 1763 would be at that time. So in speaking of the American Revolution and how this kind of started off, really the whole basis of this could be summed up with this mantra: no taxation without representation. The whole point of this is, while the English colonists were settling in this region and developing their different little colonies in the East Coast, right, and trying to be independent, what was really upsetting to them was the fact that at this time in Parliament, the English decided, okay, well, we fought this war and it was for the English, right? Meaning the French and Indian War, right? And so they felt like, well, someone needs to pay for this. And somebody had the bright idea of, well, we'll make the colonists pay for it, because after all, we're fighting this war in their own backyard on their behalf, and so they should pay for it. They want to escape our area or live here and settle. Then they're going to have to pay for this. Now the question was, how are they going to pay for it? Well, they decided, the powers that be in Parliament said, well, we'll tax all of their goods and services, starting with paper products, stamps, anything to that effect, tea, right? And so they imposed this sort of tax. Now, as they started to impose this tax there in the new colony, in the East Coast, the English were upset. And it wasn't about the taxes, because remember, some of the taxes were much less than other parts of the world or other parts of that particular region. And so what was the basis was, okay, you impose this tax without having any voice for us. We did not have a representative from the English colonists, from the English colony in Parliament to actually vote yay or nay on this taxation. So this whole American Revolution bit could be summed up with no taxation without representation was the basis of it. And as a result, you had different people or different groups, for instance, the Sons of Liberties, demonstrating their activism or their behavior towards what they thought about what was being imposed on them. Another interesting thing that also occurred that I feel shouldn't be missed is this Boston Massacre of 1770. So as this is going on, you had different types of people. You had people that were in favor of the British government. So you had people ruling from afar, essentially, the Brits sending over troops and ruling overseas. And then you had the Patriots, who were opposed of over what was going on over this ruling. So in effect, you had the Patriots and the Loyalists. The Loyalists were loyal to the king. The Patriots were almost like the activists. Now you had this particular event that occurred called the Boston Massacre. What ends up happening is the British Army came and shot and killed some people who were under attack by this particular mob. Well, what ends up happening is that a few people were killed. It was said that about 5 people were killed. But what the Patriots ended up doing is they heavily publicized this event and said, oh my gosh, there was this massacre by the British Army soldier, and they just exaggerated the whole bit. And so this was heavily publicized and used as propaganda. Now, what really happened was, yes, there was an attack there, and yes, people did get killed. But when you think of massacre, you're thinking of like hundreds of people, or like, at least 50 people were killed in one area, or 30 even. Well, there was only 5. 3 were killed instantly, while 2 ended up dying after, as a result of wounds that were sustained because of this event. And so, interestingly, this was kind of the catalyst for people to really jump on the bandwagon. And this kind of reminds me of 2 instances. One is that we'll talk about with Polk and Zach Taylor and him being ambushed in Texas, which resulted in the Mexican-American War, but then also almost like 9/11, right? You had these foreigners come in and they attacked, and so now you have all these people jumping on the bandwagon and wanting, just to reclaim what's right for the people. So this is interesting to note. Later on in 1775, so remember this happens in 1770, 5 years later, you would have this battle in Lexington and Concord, which would begin the American Revolution. And again, noting that a year later you would have had claimed American independence, again being signed on August 1776. July 4th, 1776 was the time that it was declared, but wouldn't be signed until August of 1776. So later, finally, as I mentioned, it wouldn't be until years and years and years later that the Brits would finally acknowledge the U.S. to be sovereign and independent from their rule, and you would have the final establishment of the 13 original colonies in 1783. And so here is a picture of what areas were the original 13 colonies. All right, so meanwhile in Mexico, you have different things going on. You have this sort of idea of creating independence as well. You have Miguel Hidalgo, who was the person who who was responsible for leading all of the troops there, right? And Jose Maria Morelos would follow him after. So this starts off with the Querétaro Literacy Club that was meant to educate people over European literacy. And so slowly but surely, what ended up happening under Miguel Hidalgo's rule, or not rule, but his responsibility over these clubs, you ended up having people talking about politics, right? And so as the powers that be started to catch wind, and now we're in Mexico, remember, they're like, hey, this isn't supposed to be happening. And so slowly but surely, Miguel Hidalgo, what he ended up doing is having an underground, quote unquote, literacy club, but really it was meant to talk about all of these different gripes that were going on in terms of wanting to gain independence. And so Miguel Hidalgo, who was a priest and seen as a criollo puro, would have led these efforts. And so this is where you have El Grito de Dolores, the cry of pain, or the cry in the town of Dolores, where he rings this bell and proclaims that it was time to liberate Mexico. So this goes on, and this goes on for quite some time, 10 years. So in 1810 would be the first time that you see this going on, and it wouldn't be until later on, 1820, 1821, until you finally catch the independence. So one similarity from the fall of the Aztecs in 1521, you wouldn't have reached Mexican independence until 1821. So 1521, fall of the Aztecs, 1821. See how there's that correlation there. You have Agustín de Iturbide, who would moderate this conflict between the conservatives and the liberals, and then eventually saying, okay, now that we have this struggle coming to an end and gaining our independence, now we need to talk about what our plan of action is. And so he denotes this plan of the three guarantees, and he talks about, one, setting up Mexico as an independent monarch. So you still have this monarch, however, it's independent. And so, of course, it was in his favor to name himself as being the person who would be in charge of this monarch. Catholicism, or the Roman Catholic Church, would maintain its privileges, right? And criollos and gachupines would be considered equals. And so this is so ironic, as I mentioned before, how we're talking about independence and, being tired of being seen as subordinates or in this role, and yet when we come to this plan de iguala, or the plan of the three guarantees, instead of talking about everybody being seen as equals, or at least under this new independent monarch, we're simply only addressing the criollos and gachupines, who are those that are the top of the casta system. So, of course, his reign wouldn't last as long. Iturbide would soon be exiled in 1823. Antonio Lopez was one who would help support these efforts, right? And you have different people in presidencies, Guadalupe Victoria being the first, with Vicente Guerrero being the second in office. So going now into Texas. So as this is going on, now we have final independence in Mexico by 1821, right? U.S. independence would have been first initially introduced in 1776, but officially releasing any type of rule or British rule by 1783. So as something is happening in the U.S. side, another thing is happening in the Mexican side. And so Texas is kind of what brings both together. And so again, in this quest of trying to populate these different areas and sending different people to govern different areas, we saw that Texas was quickly going to be a problem, right? Later on, by 1860s, right, we have this idea of wanting to have free states versus slave states, and that was kind of the basis for people wanting to disassociate themselves in Texas and revolt and have their own independent nation, if they will, so they can have their own types of policies within that region. Because remember, at one point, Mexico proclaims that it is against the law to have African slaves or to have slavery per se. So as people are coming into this area, you have European immigrants coming into the area as well. And so finally, Mexico says, you know what, we're going to have an immigration ban. And so they place this immigration ban and they say no European immigration here whatsoever in Texas. Remember, Texas at the time was part of Mexico. And so what happens? Well, the settlers that are there, they reject this ban, and of course they're doing what they want, and eventually are trying to come together in order to revolt. So as Lopez de Santa Anna hears about this, he proclaims, okay, I'm going to retake this area and show them who's boss. I need to settle this once and for all. And so again, last time we talked about him coming into this area. There's this huge battle that is going on. In the midst of it all, right, a few days before the end of this battle in this mission, or the Battle of the Alamo, Texas proclaims their independence, right? So they are independent. So a few days before. So it ends March 6th, the battle in the Alamo, but by March 2nd, Texas has its independence, or proclaims its independence in 1836. Now, we have another battle that happens here in Goliad that is right before the Battle of San Jacinto, in which Lopez de Santa Anna would be in that region. But this is often overshadowed by the Battle of the Alamo, particularly because you had Sam Houston, who was in charge or caught wind of what had occurred. And so he started to develop this plan to go and attack, or have this surprise attack over Lopez de Santa Anna and his men. And so that ends up happening in San Jacinto as they retreat. And this results in the Treaty of Velasco. And so again, remember, there's two treaties. One treaty was signed in private, one was in public. The public treaty was kind of a facade for everyone, basically saying, okay, we're going to retreat, we're going to stop what we're doing, we're going to go back and tell our men to stop, right, to cease all fire. And then because he was in captivity, basically they forced Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna to sign a treaty that says that their land would extend from the top of what is known as Texas all the way down to the Rio Grande. Well, because of the way in which it was done, Mexico did not ever acknowledge or ratify this treaty. And so for all they knew in Mexico, they said, no, you don't. Your land is not extending all the way to the Rio Bravo or the Rio Grande. It extends to the Nueces River. And so now what ends up happening is that you have this disputed territory where the American side is saying, well, my land goes all the way down to the Rio Bravo, and Mexico is saying, nope, your land extends up until the Nueces River. And so that is what's going on in that time. And so this is what we're talking about here in this territory. So mind you, at this time in 1836, you now have the Republic of Texas, which would have lasted until 1845, which would later be annexed by the U.S. So there's a short period in which, a good 11 years, where Texas is independent, neither controlled by Mexico or the US. And so just keep that in the back of your mind, because this will come into play later on when I mention some other things. So 8 years later, we have President John Taylor, who would be responsible for annexing that area, the Republic of Texas. And again, this is going towards this idea of manifest destiny. And so that would be associated with President John Taylor at that time. By 1845, you have this official term of manifest destiny. Now, we've talked before about how manifest destiny has always been in existence, but we never really had some sort of term. So it was until this Irish gentleman by the name of John Lewis O'Sullivan, who was a columnist and editor who used the term manifest destiny, which was interesting because at the time when Polk was running for campaign, he sees this article that explains why the U.S. was being so aggressive in and acquiring land or annexing land, that he used this term. And so he's like, yes, it's manifest destiny, and the basis of manifest destiny is basically God's given right to this land. And so again, who's going to question God at that time? Remember, so many people were all about religion and this idea of God, and if you question God, then it was, very, it was blasphemy if you did. So Polk uses this. Of course, he focuses on acquiring land. Again, remember, he wasn't the front runner when campaigning for this presidency. And so he starts with the Oregon Territory, and he is successful in that. Later on, he's trying to annex California. He was unsuccessful. He scratches his head and says, okay, what are we going to do next? And in order to get this land, and he remembers that there's this boundary dispute in Texas. So he sends his general, Zach Taylor, to check out that area. And so that was his in, because he knew that other people were looking at this territory and he needed to act fast. Otherwise, he risked other people acquiring it or taking it under his nose. And there goes his presidency, and then also his vow to manifest destiny and fulfilling the dreams of the United States, to owning land from sea to shining sea, right? And so he was particularly afraid of the British coming and swooping in from underneath him. So he sends Zach Taylor, and of course, Zach Taylor goes, he scopes out the area, and what happens? He's ambushed by Mexican cavalry, right? Mexicans are like, why are you here? You shouldn't be here, right? And so this prompts Polk's famous speech, talking about Mexico has passed the boundary of the U.S., they've invaded our territory and shed American blood on American soil. And so he's super upset over this. So, of course, declaration of war, his plan works. Of course, Mexico declares, and now you have the Mexican and American War. Well, not everyone was in accordance with what was going on, especially young Abraham Lincoln, who had, he's not yet president yet, and he comes up with this idea of having this spot resolution. He says, well, do we have merit for going to war over this? Is it indeed American soil? Maybe we should locate the exact spot, right? Everyone laughs at him to the point where they nicknamed him Spotty Lincoln, because all he's doing is, hey, the spot resolution. Hey, we should do the spot resolution, right? And so nonetheless, they ignore him and they still go to war, and they're back and forth. So Mexicans and Americans are at it, and they're back and forth. Until finally peace is reached in 1848. And what do they talk about? They talk about the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which will once and for all suggest where the boundary lies for Texas. And then they would purchase all of this land here, depicted in red, for $15 million. And later on, they would come back for more in the Gadsden Purchase. But in this time period, they would have taken all of that. And of course, they finally complete their manifest destiny to have land from sea to shining sea. And which is so interesting about the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo of 1848, it was signed in February of 1848, but it wouldn't come into force until July 4th, ring a bell, 1848. So interesting correlation here. In the beginning, the birth of the U.S. would have occurred on July 4th, 1776, through the Declaration of American Independence, and it would have ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which would finally come into force on July 4th, 1848. So it's interesting how 4th of July has that double meaning of the beginning and the end through these treaties in completing this expansion, or this American expansion. One thing that I wanted to point out of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, because again, remember, many Mexicans lived in this what was once Mexican land, right? And this border moved from where it once was to now what present day is, right? So the present day border is in between, if we were looking at, San Diego and Tijuana all the way, out going east, right? Before it was above that, right? And now because of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the border moved from the tip tops of California and that whole region all the way down to what it is today. Now, one of the things that the people who were sitting at the table had to talk about was, what are we going to do with the Mexicans that are now in this newly acquired U.S. land? And so they talked about the people having 1 year from that date to declare whether or not they wanted to be American citizens or not, right? And if they didn't and they stayed in that newly acquired U.S. land, then they would be treated as such, as if they were American-born or naturalized American citizens, as under the American Constitution. So they would have citizenship rights and protection under that American Constitution. So in these articles that are highlighted, Article 5 talked about this boundary dispute. Article 8 talked about citizenship and property that they would be entitled to, right? Article 9 would talked about rights as citizens, as protection under the Constitution, and Article 10 would talk about protection of land grants. Now, this was initially written. Unfortunately, what was done in theory and what was done in actuality is two different things. And I'll change into the next slide here. There was this huge disagreement after it had already been signed, right, about the language in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, specifically looking at the modification of Article 9. And what they said was, and this is Polk and his men, they said, well, I'm not sure if we like this language, so maybe we should replace it with the language from Article 3 from the Treaty of Louisiana, right? Saying, yeah, they would be protected, but the language was not an immediate effect, right? So it's kind of leaving this protection as ambiguous. And you can look up the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and look for those articles specifically. Then Article 10, remember Article 10 talking about protection of land grants, it said that it would be stricken out, right? And the protocol would suggest that the burden of proof would be on the grantee. Later on, they would come back and reinforce the provision. But what's interesting about Article 10, that initially it was saying, we're going to protect land grants. And if you had a land grant, you're protected, right? However, now that they have this new language saying, well, the burden of proof would be placed on the grantee, what that meant was that if you didn't have some sort of proof or documentation, or if, let's say, the powers that be knocked on your door and said, hey, where's your land grant, and took it from you and then ripped it up and threw it away, and they said, where's your burden of proof, and you didn't have any because you didn't have a copy, guess what? You would be SOL, unfortunately, shit out of luck, right? And you would be forced to get up and go because you no longer had ties to that land that was initially yours. And so this became problematic, and that's why you had other people or other activists like Reyes Tijerina that would go to bat over some of these things that would go on. And it gets even more so interesting when we talk about Texas as well. So one example is in 1856, for instance, so this is long before, so long after. So 1848, remember, 1848 was when the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, and this treaty was talked about in terms of what people's rights were and ties to land. Well, years later in 1856, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo did not apply to Texas. So people living in Texas, right, were kind of SOL as well, right? And you're probably scratching your head, well, why? If this would have been like fair game for people, because this was once Mexican land and now U.S. land, so you would think that by default it would go under the treaty. Well, what they ruled was that because Texas had been admitted into the Union in 1845, and therefore was independent from Mexico, they did not have any ties to this grant or these land grants. So if you were Mexican or had these or were granted land anytime before this time period of 1845, then you would no longer have had full entitlement, right? So it's interesting when we talk about that, because really when we look at Texas, they're looking at Texas as a whole body, but really between 1836 and 1845, it really denoted this portion, right? But what the U.S. Supreme Court at that time in 1856 thought was, well, at that time period, we recognize Texas as this whole entire body. Remember the dispute? And therefore, anybody who was in the disputed land would not be entitled or would not be protected under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Now, that was problematic. Many people had to leave because of this new ruling. Years later, people went back, right, and then started fighting this. But by then, so many people had been kicked out of Texas and this land was taken away. So unfortunately, many Mexicans were robbed, and the way the development of the U.S. is very interesting in how we look at it through a different type of lens here. And lastly, I know we're rounding 701. I have a few more slides. I just wanted to note, as a response to all of this chaos that went on, people were saying enough is enough. And so came out early 1800s, or late 1800s, early 1900s, heroes of the late 1800s, early 1900s. You had these iconic figures that came out because they were tired of all of these things going on over the people. So you had people like Gregorio Cortés, Juan Cortina, Joaquin Murrieta, Vasquez over here. Joaquin Murrieta seen as, the Mexican Robin Hood, for example, stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. And so all of this stemmed out of all of these injustices and inequalities that were going or inequitable circumstances that were going on, based on the way the system was being run, dating from the 1500s. Of course, these people weren't alive at the 1500s, but catching, towards the latter part, especially referencing 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And so how many people were in Mexican territory and had to leave, came out these quote unquote outlaws or bandits that the English or European settlers would coin terms over these iconic figures. And then also, I didn't want to leave out some iconic women of the 1800s, noting some women who went out of their stereotypical gender roles. So, for instance, Gertrudis Barcelo, who is known as La Tules, ran a gambling casino in Santa Fe and made a fortune. Frances Garcia, who ran and owned a lumber yard. Other women who were, directors of banks, so bankers, if you will, and the list goes on. So just to give you that almost like food for thought in terms of iconic men and what they did, and also iconic women who stepped out of their boundaries. Okay, so we're a little past time. I really hope this course had made you reconsider what we tend to think of as the master narrative and how we're socialized to believe, what or how our U.S. was formed. This course sometimes makes you think about, what is up and what is down, right? In terms of power dynamics, this casta system, racial inequalities, and just really how the U.S. came to be. And we cannot forget that the major underpinnings of the development of the U.S. or the world, if you will, is racism and inequality and power and people who are striving to be at the top, right? So anyhow, I know it was a short 8 weeks. That's all I have for you. A couple of reminders. The final exam is due Saturday at midnight, technically 11:59, but if you're a couple minutes after the fact, it's totally fine. And then as well, the final essay has been moved to Friday at midnight. So at this time, if you have any questions for me, I will keep the chat window open. If anybody wants to address anything, I can answer the questions as best as I can. Okay, it looks like we don't really have any questions. If for some reason your chat is not working, please feel free to email me and I'll address it as best as I can. This video will be posted. I will make sure to download it right now and send it out as soon as it publishes, and it'll be there for you. Again, don't forget that this week coming up, the week that we're in, I have scheduled, or you have scheduled, meetings, group meetings. Again, if you do not need to meet with me this week, send me an email so I can take you off my calendar and you can get the remaining 10 points for meeting with me. I have one last question. When will the final test be open? I will alert you. My aim is to have it no later than tomorrow for the final. If there's any problems with that, I'll let you know that as well through our Blackboard email. All right. Well, thank you so much. It was a pleasure having all of you here, and good luck to you all.